Inside a bank of cloud 4 miles above the farmland of northern India, on the evening of the 12th of November 1996, two aircraft were closing on one another head-on at a combined speed of more than 1,000 miles per hour, and neither crew could see the other. One was a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747, climbing away from Delhi with 312 people aboard. The other was a Kazakhstan Airlines Ilyushin cargo jet, descending toward Delhi with 37. They were flying along the same narrow corridor of sky in opposite directions, and the only thing keeping them apart was 1,000 feet of vertical space and the voice of a single air traffic controller on the ground who could not see the altitude of either of them. In the last seconds before they met, one of the two aircraft was in the wrong place, 500 feet below where it had been told to be, and still sinking. Neither crew would ever know what hit them. When the Ilyushin's tail sliced through the Boeing's left wing, all 349 people aboard the two aircraft were, in effect, already dead, though it would take the wreckage several minutes to reach the ground. No one survived. No distress call was made by either crew. It remains to this day the deadliest mid-air collision in the history of aviation, and at the center of it was not a mechanical failure or a storm, but something far quieter and harder to engineer against. A handful of words, spoken in a language that not everyone in one of the two cockpits could understand. The Ilyushin had left Shymkent in Kazakhstan early that afternoon. It was a Soviet-built freighter operated by an airline close enough to bankruptcy that it was keeping itself alive on charter runs like this one. A group of traders from neighboring Kyrgyzstan had hired the aircraft to fly them to Delhi to buy Indian textiles, which they would carry home and sell at a profit. There were 27 of them aboard, along with a crew of 10. The flight south was routine, a little over 3 hours in the air, cruising at 33,000 feet toward one of the busiest and most complicated pieces of airspace in the region. At the same time, on the ground in Delhi, a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 was being prepared for the reverse journey. Outbound to Dhahran and Jeddah, carrying 289 passengers, many of them Indian laborers traveling to the Gulf to work and send money home. The captain was Khalid al-Shubaili, 44 years old with nearly 10,000 flight hours. His first officer was an American, Nazir Khan, 39. The flight engineer was Ahmed Edries, 36. It was, by every measure, a seasoned and well-rested crew, familiar with the aircraft and with the difficult skies over Delhi. Those skies were the first part of the problem. In 1996, Delhi was an anomaly among the world's major airports. Most large airports separated their arriving and departing traffic into different corridors, so that aircraft climbing out and aircraft descending in were never sharing the same piece of sky. Delhi did not. The airspace around the city was largely reserved for the military, and civilian aircraft were confined to a single air corridor. One highway in the sky, designated Gulf 452, used by traffic moving in both directions at once. As the volume of commercial flights into India grew through the 1990s, all of that additional traffic had to be funneled into the same single lane. At one end of it, that evening, the Kazakh Ilyushin was descending inbound. At the other end, the Saudi 747 was climbing outbound. They were pointed directly at each other. The man responsible for keeping them apart was an approach controller named V.K. Dutta, 43 years old, an experienced controller working a busy evening with 5 aircraft, demanding his attention at once. But the real limitation Dutta faced that night was not the traffic load. It was the equipment. The radar at his disposal was an older primary radar, which painted each aircraft as a simple, glowing dot on his screen. It showed him where each aircraft was in the horizontal plane, but it told him nothing about altitude. To know how high any aircraft was flying, Dutta had only one method available to him. He had to ask the pilots over the radio and trust the numbers they read back to him. There was no independent way to verify those numbers. If a crew told him they were at 15,000 feet, he had no choice but to believe them. And if they were wrong, there was no second system anywhere in the chain to catch the error. As the two aircraft drew toward each other along the corridor, Dutta gave each of them its instructions. The Kazakh Ilyushin, inbound, was cleared to descend to 15,000 feet and to hold there. The Saudi 747, outbound, was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet and to hold there. If both crews did exactly as instructed, the two aircraft would pass each other with 1,000 feet of vertical space between them, the Kazakh jet 1,000 feet above, the Saudi jet 1,000 feet below, and would each continue safely on their way. It was a simple, standard plan, and it depended entirely on both aircraft being where they said they were. The Saudi crew flew their part exactly. They climbed smoothly to 14,000 feet, leveled off, and reported holding there. The flight data recorder later confirmed it beyond any doubt. The 747 reached its assigned altitude and stayed on it, precisely where it had been told to be. The problem was entirely inside the other cockpit. The Ilyushin had been built for the Soviet military, and it carried a crew of 5, a captain, a first officer, a flight engineer, a navigator, and a dedicated radio operator. On paper, this was a strength, more people to share the workload. In practice, on this particular flight, it created a fatal bottleneck. Of the 5 men in the cockpit, only one, the radio operator, Igor Rep, spoke enough English to communicate with Delhi Air Traffic Control. Every instruction that came up from the ground had to pass through him, be translated into Russian, and be relayed to the pilots and the navigator. And every readback the pilots wanted to send had to travel back through him in the other direction. The crew was, in effect, playing a game of translation under time pressure in a crowded cockpit in some of the most demanding airspace in the world. There was a second translation happening as well, and it was arguably worse. The Ilyushin had originally been designed to measure altitude in meters, as all Soviet aircraft were. To operate outside the former Soviet bloc, 2 of its 4 altimeters had been converted to read in feet. But the altimeter directly in front of the first officer who was flying the aircraft still read in meters. So every altitude instruction that arrived from Delhi in feet had to be converted into meters before the first officer could act on it, and every reading he took had to be converted back into feet before it could be reported to the ground. 2 separate translations, language and units, layered on top of each other in the seconds available during a busy descent. At around 6:39 in the evening, the radio operator reported to Dutta that the Ilyushin had reached its assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, but it had not. The flight data recorder would later show that the aircraft was at that moment still descending through roughly 16,400 feet, well above its clearance, and still coming down. Why Rep reported an altitude the aircraft had not reached is something no one can now say for certain. He had no altimeter of his own in front of him. To read the aircraft's altitude at all, he had to crane awkwardly around the first officer to see the instruments. He may have misjudged the reading. He may have confused the words reached and approaching. He may simply have assumed they were where they were supposed to be. Whatever the reason, Dutta accepted the report at face value because he had no way to check it, and he passed the Ilyushin its first warning of the other aircraft. Traffic at 12 o'clock, he told them. A Saudi Boeing 747 10 miles away at 14,000 feet, likely to cross in another 5 miles. Report it in sight. This was the first moment either crew had been told the other aircraft existed. Inside the Kazakh cockpit, the flight recorder captured the crew beginning to discuss the traffic in Russian, trying to work out where the other aircraft was and to spot it visually. There was a long silence. Then Rep came back on the radio and asked Dutta to confirm the distance. 8 miles, Dutta told them, at 14,000 feet. The radio operator acknowledged. "Now looking," he said, and gave the flight's call sign. It was the last transmission ever received from Kazakhstan, 1907. Somewhere in these seconds, the aircraft passed down through 15,000 feet. Its assigned altitude, the altitude at which it should have leveled and stopped, and kept going. It did not stop. It kept sinking. For roughly 30 seconds, no one in the cockpit said anything about it, and the altimeter unwound. 14,800 feet, 14,600, 14,400. Outside the windows, the sky was overcast, and the descending Ilyushin now slipped into a large bank of cloud. From the opposite direction, climbing steadily along the same corridor at 14,000 feet, the Saudi 747 entered the very same cloud. Then, inside the Kazakh cockpit, the radio operator saw it. The altimeter, the real number. They were far too low. His voice breaks through the recording. "Hold the level," he says. But instead of leveling off immediately, the captain hesitates. He asks what level they had been given. He is no longer certain of their clearance. The flight engineer, silent until now, says the word maintain, without saying what altitude to maintain. Only the radio operator still holds the correct number in his head, and he shouts it, "Keep to level 150, don't descend." Now the captain understands. He disconnects the autopilot and calls for full power to climb back up to where they were supposed to be. The engines begin to spool up, and the radio operator shouts one more time, his voice coming apart. "Get to 150 because the other one is at 140. That one." In that instant he had seen it, a shape resolving out of the cloud directly ahead of them, the landing lights of a Boeing 747 filling the windscreen. The Ilyushin, climbing now on full power at exactly the wrong moment, rose the last few feet directly into the path of the descending jet. Had the Kazakh crew held their descent, or climbed a moment earlier or later, the two aircraft might have missed each other in the cloud. Instead, they met. The Ilyushin's tail struck the Boeing's left wing and horizontal stabilizer, and in a single motion sheared them from the aircraft. For a heartbeat, the two giants were locked together in a fireball, and then they broke apart and fell. The Boeing spiraling down with fire, streaming from its severed wing, the Ilyushin, its tail gone, dropping in a flat spin toward the fields below. There was a single eyewitness in the air. A United States Air Force pilot named Timothy Place was flying a military transport on approach to Delhi some distance away, descending through the same general block of sky, when he saw the cloud ahead of him suddenly flash a bright, lurid orange. He wondered for a moment whether he was watching a rocket launch. Then a second plume of fire appeared, and both streams of burning wreckage began to fall toward the ground. He understood that he had just watched an aircraft accident, and he reported it to Delhi. On the ground, in the approach control room, V.K. Dutta had watched the two dots on his radar screen move together, merge into one, fail to separate, and then vanish entirely. He called both flights again and again and received no answer. On the recording, in the final seconds before the Saudi aircraft's recorder stopped, its pilots can be heard reciting the words spoken by observant Muslims in the face of death, a declaration of faith and a prayer for forgiveness. The wreckage fell across the farmland near a town called Charkhi Dadri, roughly 100 kilometers west of Delhi, scattered over a debris field more than 7 kilometers long. All 349 people aboard the two aircraft were killed. A handful of people aboard the Ilyushin were found still alive by the first rescuers to reach the field, but they died soon afterward. It was, and remains, the worst mid-air collision the world has ever seen. The Indian government convened a court of inquiry under a senior judge, Ramesh Chandra Lahoti, to determine what had happened. The flight data recorders, which India did not have the equipment to read, were sent abroad, the Kazakh recorder to Moscow, the Saudi recorder to England. When investigators combed the wreckage, one detail told much of the story before the recorders ever came back. The tail section of the Ilyushin was found at the very beginning of the debris trail, meaning it had been the first part to break away, which meant the Kazakh aircraft had been below the Saudi aircraft at the moment of impact. Exactly where it was never supposed to be. The 4 altimeters recovered from the Ilyushin's cockpit each showed a different reading, a testament to the confusion of units and translation that had reigned inside it. The inquiry cleared the controller, V.K. Dutta, completely. With the primitive radar available to him, he had done everything correctly and had no possible means of detecting that the altitude the Kazakh crew reported was false. He was allowed to return to duty 3 days after the crash. The cause was placed with the Kazakh crew, their unauthorized descent below their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, and the failures of communication and coordination inside their cockpit that had allowed it to happen and go uncorrected until the final seconds. Poor English proficiency, the layering of 2 translations, and a crew structure in which the one man who understood the instructions was not the man flying the aircraft. All of it combined into a chain that no single person in the cockpit had been positioned to break. The consequences reshaped the skies over India and, eventually, the world. Investigators revealed that there had been 10 near misses in Indian airspace in the preceding period, many of them involving airlines from the former Soviet bloc, and many attributed to language difficulties. Indian air traffic controllers went on strike, demanding formal licensing and better equipment and the creation of separate civilian corridors around Delhi, so that arriving and departing traffic would never again share the same lane. India petitioned the International Civil Aviation Organization to require a standard minimum level of English proficiency for pilots and controllers worldwide, a standard that was, in time, adopted internationally. And India became the second country in the world after the United States to mandate that aircraft in its skies carry a collision avoidance system, an onboard device that detects other aircraft directly, independent of any radar or any voice on the ground, and warns the crew to climb or descend to avoid them. Had such a system been aboard the 2 aircraft over Charkhi Dadri that evening, it would very likely have prevented the collision entirely. The last, quietest tragedy of the disaster was in the identifying of the dead. Many of the bodies were never identified at all. Some of the passengers aboard the Saudi aircraft had come from such deeply poor and remote rural communities that even their next of kin could not be traced. Somewhere, in all likelihood, there are still families who never learned what became of a brother, or a sister, or a son who had gone abroad to earn a living, and who simply, one November, went away and never came home.